FlySafair's overbooking policy has drawn criticism after numerous passengers were left stranded in airports over the weekend. This is despite holding confirmed tickets. One of the customers, Tato Miles Nsala, has shared his frustration on social media platform X, revealing that he was denied a seat despite booking in advance. FlySafair has apologized, stating that overbooking helps keep fares affordable for the customers. How common is overbooking in the aviation industry, and is it legal? Aviation analyst and editor of SA Flyer magazine, Dr. Leitch, is now joining us for this conversation. Dr. Leitch, a very good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us. I can only imagine the frustration of having to buy your ticket and there's confirmation that you have your ticket, and then all of a sudden you are told that actually you cannot board the flight because of overbooking. Explain to us what happens in the aviation sector around overbooking and why this is part of what is being done in the aviation sector.
Yeah, hi, good morning to you and your viewers. Well, overbooking is in fact not just Safair's problem, it's a worldwide problem, if you like. What happens is that on a typical flight, let's say there are 183 seats, inevitably 2 or 3 people are just not going to make it. Either they're going to get stuck in traffic on the way to the airport, their car's going to break down, they're going to have a domestic crisis, maybe they even miss the announcement of the boarding on the flight, they're already at the airport. So during peak times, it makes sense financially, practically, for airlines to sell maybe 185, 186 seats out of the 183 that are available. And if the worst happens and everyone arrives, well, then what they normally do is they just offer a cash incentive for anyone who looks as though they're not in a hurry at all to take the next flight. I spoke to FlySafair about this, and they say they actually give cash envelopes to anyone who's prepared to take a flight. So normally they get to the people at the end of the queue, the people who are not in a hurry, and they'll say, listen, we'll give you 1,000 Rand if you'll wait for the next flight. And most of the time people are happy about that. You know, the people not in a hurry are very happy to have their seats basically paid for or a free flight the next time round. Obviously, it can be immensely inconvenient. And I'd just like to point out to the aggrieved viewer, I've forgotten what his name was, who launched the problem, that if he'd actually booked a specific seat, which you can do, admittedly you've got to pay another 30 Rand or something, then he wouldn't have been bumped off the flight. He would have been allocated that specific seat. So it would have given him the assurance that he wouldn't have been bumped off. So for the most part, this is actually considered a win-win. And I can tell your viewers that this is in fact not considered a problem by the Consumer Protection Act. There's specific provisions for it. As I said, actually, people benefit from being bumped on flights.
Okay, and we're going to go to the concerns that have also been raised around whether there are any protections and recourse when it comes to the Consumer Protection Act. But this idea of being bumped off, for me, it's a bit. It makes it a bit uncomfortable because the other point is that unlike, for instance, buying a product off a shelf, me traveling to a certain destination, there is time that is included in that, so it is time bound. Perhaps I need to be at a certain place at a certain time, maybe going to a function, maybe even going for an interview or anything of that nature. If I lose that interview, if I don't make it on time, it has a detrimental effect on me, even though I booked on time for my flight.
Oh, of course, and that's why this is, you know, one has to have a lot of sympathy for those who are aggrieved, for those who do get bumped. And I mean, there are obvious remedies for this. One of the most obvious, apart from booking your seat, which I mentioned, is simply not being at the really end of the queue, because it's only at the end of the check-in queue that they're going to know that they've got more people than they've got seats available. It doesn't often happen, but it does happen. Internationally, I was traveling in Europe in September. The check-in manager has actually often auctions the seat. They'll say, here, I'll give somebody 30 euros for argument's sake if they take the next flight. It happens a lot on the low-cost carriers like Ryanair and EasyJet. So it's one way of the low-cost carriers actually making sure that all the seats are sold, making sure that they're getting the maximum yield per flight, and thus keeping their prices low. So for many people consider it a yield, a win-win. Let me just take your viewers back to the good bad old days before we had this thing called active yield management or dynamic pricing. where everyone paid the same price for a seat. You know, nowadays you can end up paying 3 times as much as the person sitting next to you, depending on when you book. This is all part of how airlines are keeping their prices actually very affordable for those who book early. And obviously, if you check in early, you know you're going to get your seat rather than if you wait till the end of the queue.
Yeah, and I totally understand that. Still a bit uncomfortable with this idea of you buy a ticket and then unfortunately you can't board the flight. And I just want to quickly share an experience with you, Dr. Leitch. I remember being I wanted to catch a flight to I think it was Bloemfontein at the time, a couple of years ago. And when I got to the airport as well, I was told that unfortunately there are no longer seats available, but you can wait. You wait. We might just have a seat available. A friend of mine was also traveling to Bloemfontein, arrived late, so checked in late, and they told him that unfortunately, because you've checked in late, you will not be allowed to board the flight. But instead, the seat was offered to me. But we are both there, ready to board the plane. Please make me understand how that is fair.
Well, bear in mind there's also this thing called standby. So they'll put you on standby for anyone who's you know, if a seat does become available, if somebody doesn't come. So if your friend checked in late, in other words, checked in after the 20 minutes or half an hour before the boarding time, then that seat would have become available automatically on the system. So, hey, you won because your friend checked in late. So even though you were on standby, you got the seat. And let me point out that often it's not the airline's fault at all that there's been overbooking. Quite often an airplane goes technical and it can't fly, and they have to pull a standby one out. So instead of having an 183-seater as FlySafair normally flies, they might only have a 160-seat aircraft, which are the ones on standby. So then 20 people, you know, end up getting bumped or not being accommodated. It's a common problem, and the airlines, as I said, they deal with it by offering incentives for people to move off. And at the same time, as I said, maybe you get there early enough, you go on standby, and you get the seat because somebody didn't arrive on time.
Yeah. Early on, we were speaking about the Consumer Protection Act and the recourse that is available for consumers. On social media, there was a debate around the Section 47 of the Consumer Protection Act and whether or not it says that what the aviation sector is doing is unlawful. What's your interpretation of what that law says or that legislation?
Yeah, the opinions that I've got on it is that the Consumer Protection Act specifically provides for this problem because, as I said, it's a common problem. Sometimes it's not in the aviation industry's fault, and more often than not, the solution benefits everybody. So I'm assured by, in this case, FlySafair, that the Consumer Protection Act doesn't apply, and that obviously, you know, they can find people who are prepared to wait for the next flight. The Act, however, does give, and the conditions of carriage, which is the contract that the airline enters into with the passenger, does provide for the airline having to get the passenger to there. But yes, maybe it'll be a couple of hours late, and maybe the airline will even put the passenger on another airline for the sake of completing the contract. But I'm afraid there's no specific protection offered by the Consumer Protection Act in this case.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering that with that scenario that I was painting a bit earlier on, that considering that we are speaking here about sometimes issues that are time-bound, that I have to be at a certain place at a certain time, can I bring a case against the airline and say that I've suffered a loss due to a decision that you have taken to bump me off that seat?
Well, I certainly wouldn't try and persuade the person not to. You know, he can take his chances with the legal system. But as I said, my view is that this is not an unusual procedure. And if the airline did everything within its power to get the person there on time, well, I think the airline is unlikely to be found to be at fault in this. Yes, the person may have suffered enormous emotional consequences by not being able to get to, for argument's sake, his mother's funeral. You know, those are worst possible scenarios. At the same time, there can be enormous or significant financial loss simply because so often these flights are connecting flights.
Yeah.
So you're flying from, your example, Bloemfontein to Joburg to catch a flight to London or Frankfurt, and now you've missed your flight there. Well, those are obviously much bigger problems, and I certainly think that you could put a case, have a case against the airline. I would suggest that they would probably be happy to settle out of court for those sort of things rather than let them drag through court with all the attendant publicity. So I would certainly not try and discourage somebody who felt they'd been aggrieved and had suffered significant financial loss because of that.
Yeah, there's a just, and this is just from a consumer's perspective, right, and a passenger's perspective, the level of unfairness, I believe, in the aviation sector. As an example, once again, I can arrive at the airport on time and the flight is delayed, right, and I don't get compensated. I get absolutely nothing. I arrive late and I'm told that actually you cannot check in because it is too late. You've missed the time to check in, and then I lose my seat. And the money that I've paid is not refunded. But yet the airline can get away with delaying me. But me delaying the airline, of course, that's going to be a major issue, but they don't compensate for that.
Yes, but it all goes into the pricing of the ticket. You can purchase a ticket at different levels. If you purchase the cheapest ticket, then there are no guarantees or comfort in that regard. And if you want to change your flight, there are huge charges, excessive charges involved if you want to change your flight or even sell your ticket to somebody else. So that's the cheapest ticket. But if you go to the next level of ticket, well, then there's much more flexibility. You can change your flight. You're not going to suffer huge penalties if you can't make that particular flight. So honestly, it's difficult for me to say this, but in a sense, airline ticket pricing and the way the whole system works is capitalism at its absolutely most perfect, most pure, simply because it's a supply and demand driven the whole time. And yes, there are absolutely rigorous schedules, which sometimes those operating on their own family time, so-called African time, might not be happy with if they arrive late and they're prevented from boarding. Even though the gate is still open, the door is still open, the plane is still sitting there. People get absolutely furious when that happens. But airlines have to stick to a schedule. And yet at the same time, airlines will have to ground an aircraft that is not fully airworthy and maybe substitute for a smaller one. So this problem continues. It's much bigger a problem in the United States and in Europe. And it's worth pointing out to your viewers, though, that South Africa is a little bit behind in terms of passenger rights in this regard. Both in the United States and in Europe, there are more rigorous penalties than we have here. For airlines unduly delaying passengers beyond typically about 3 hours, serious penalties kick in.
Okay, so maybe we should have something like that as well.
Well, but again, it would serve to make flying more expensive if airlines were carrying that risk. But certainly, passengers who tend to take their time and feel victimized by the system could benefit from it.
Okay. In conclusion, Dr. Leitch, advice to people who would be flying, how to make sure that they get a bang for their buck?
Well, the best advice is always book early, and in this particular case, if it's over a busy season, reserve a specific seat, because if you reserve that seat, well then, hey, they can't give it to somebody else. That's a very relatively cheap thing to do. And then don't try and be Mr. Super Cool and wait till the mob is finished trying to get through the check-in, the check-in at the departure gate, not the check-in counter. Make sure that you get through relatively early, because it's only the latecomers, the stragglers, who end up risking getting bumped onto the next flight.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. That is Dr. Guy Leitch, the aviation analyst, speaking to us about this incident that had taken place where a passenger was bumped off his seat, complained online, FlySafair bumped him off his seat. Tato, who lodged that complaint on social media, and FlySafair then came out in defense of that decision, saying that it's common, it happens in the aviation sector.